Silk Road Studies Fall Colloquium Series. We took a big risk organizing something during the last week of classes, but I'm very, very pleased to see how many people showed up for this lecture. For those who don't know me, my name is Sanjot Mahendale. I am the chair of the Tang Center, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome to campus Dr. Agnieszka Helman, whose work on the science of paper brings attention, I think, to the importance of not solely focusing on the word in trying to understand the development of textual traditions, in particular when it comes to chronology and a manuscript's place of origin. Dr. Helman received a PhD in Humanities and the Science of Art from the Faculty of Fine Arts at Nicolaus Copernicus University in Poland, as well as 2 higher degrees in bibliology and information science from the University of Warsaw and in archaeometry from the University of Hamburg in Germany. She has a dual appointment as adjunct professor in the Department of Books and Media History at the University of Warsaw and as adjunct professor in the Center for the Study of Manuscript Culture at the University of Hamburg. Her work on paper has been supported by many different grants, the most recent from the German Research Foundation for a project entitled The Mustang Archives, Analysis of Handwritten Documents via Ethnographic Study of Papermaking Traditions in Nepal, and also from the National Science Center in Poland for the project The Manuscripts of Mardzong Caves in Mustang, Nepal, Interpretation, Paper Analysis, and Dating. The importance of her expertise is widely recognized in the field of Buddhist studies, as demonstrated by collaboration with different scholars in the field of Buddhism. Most recently, a collaboration with Professor Charles Ramble on Tibetan cultural heritage of the Mustang region, but also from 2014 to 2017 with Professor Matthew Kapstein on Tibetan manuscripts and early prints. This was a project that was funded by the Luce Foundation. And finally, from 2010 to 2015, as a consultant to a project coordinated by Dr. Hildegard Dimberger entitled Buddhist Book Culture, the Introduction of Printing and Digital Text Reproduction in Tibetan Societies. She has written extensively on the history and typology of paper. Her most recent publications include a monograph co-authored with Charles Ramble entitled The Mardzong Manuscripts, Preservation, Interpretation and Dating of an Archaeological Find in Mustang, Nepal, and articles such as Tibetan Documents in the Archives of the Tantric Lamas of Tsognam in Mustang, Nepal, and More Than Meets the Eye, Fiber and Paper Analysis of the Chinese Manuscripts from the Silk Roads. She just flew in from Toronto, where she gave a talk at the University of Toronto. So we're very excited that you were willing to take a detour on your way back to Hamburg. Please help me welcome Dr. Helman Wozni.
Hello, it's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you for such a warm welcome. It's a great detour, I would say. So today I would like to share my research on the history and science of paper in manuscripts of Central Asia. It will be about both history and science of paper, since those are my 2 approaches. The traditional history shows paper as a global medium of communication, disseminated gradually via trade routes from China to Europe via Middle East, then to the rest of the world. The meaning and value of paper in the ancient medieval history of Asia is, however, less explored. The technological and economical transfer of paper shows this writing material as a global commodity as opposed to other materials such as silk, bamboo or palm leaves, which have always had rather local coverage. The cultural background of paper diffusion, its existence and use in cultures of Central Asia other than Chinese, has hardly been explored, despite the fact that Central Asia seems to be a key region for the origins and early history of paper. Paper has been assumed to be of Chinese origin and therefore was automatically incorporated as an integral part of the Chinese history. Production of paper then quickly developed and permitted the wide diffusion of works designed for the spread of religious, scientific, or literary ideas. Also, compared to other writing materials, paper allowed for the inexpensive and relatively easy multiplication of copy. However, we cannot be entirely sure who were producers, sellers, and buyers in Central Asia. It is nearly impossible to disentangle the historical sequence of events leading to the invention of true paper from the legends that surround this discovery. The year AD 105 is commonly cited as the date of the invention of paper. Historical records in the history of the later Han Dynasty for that year shows that the technique of papermaking was reported by Cai Lun to the Eastern Han Emperor, and that those first paper samples were made of tree bark, remnants of hemp, rags of cloth, and fishing nets. This one sentence has brought about enormous speculation and discussions which continue to this day. For example, Laufer in 1931 commented on this passage, pointing out that those many components were not mixed together to result in one paper, but that each substance was the principal constituent to make a particular kind of paper. Other scholars, however, interpreted all mentioned substances as components of singular final product. In fact, both suppositions are vague, since Cai Lun's words do not state clearly how this first true paper was made. Ling highlighted that true paper derived from bark cloth called tapa, which involved pounding of the inner bark. It is phloem of paper mulberry bark, as it was practiced in southern China, Cai Lun's native land. According to Ling, Cai Lun's inspirations may also have sprung from silk paper technology, which at that point likely didn't exist at all. On the margins of scholarly debate, other theories also abound. One such theory is posited by Li Fang in an article stating that materialist dialectics of Marxism and Leninist theory led him to the conclusion that the oldest paper was formed by nature. According to this author, ancient people living by the Fang River in Chang'an were inspired by plant material that dropped into a flooded river and produced the first paper. So we have a lot of mythology around the paper discovery. While it is difficult to separate fact from myth, it is commonly accepted that paper was invented in China and spread to the rest of the world via the Silk Roads. According to written sources, referenced by many scholars, by AD 751, paper production had spread westward to Arabia via Samarkand. There is a story about Chinese paper makers who were captured by the Arab army as prisoners of war in the Battle of Talas and later settled in Samarkand. The Arabs supposedly learned the craft from the Chinese prisoners and built the first paper mill in Baghdad sometimes between 793 and 795. Yet this account oversimplifies the matter. Papermaking may have been practiced in Samarkand decades before that battle. Around that time, papermaking had spread west of the Pamirs, probably not because of one singular event, but rather toward a gradual transmission via many roads. The craft continued to spread gradually from Islamic Asia to Europe and from there around the world. Archaeological evidence, excavations in China in the beginning of the 20th century provided new evidence that shed some light on the origins of paper. Based on the archaeological discovery in 1933, a new theory of paper origins that it was invented by the craftsmen of the Western Han surfaced in 1948. Among scholars, this idea began to take hold as more and more ancient paper was excavated in the Western Han, some evidently earlier than AD 105, the year of Cai Lun's breakthrough. However, what started as an academic discussion, transformed a bit into a political affair, and in the late 1970s, the governmental-run papermaking institute of the Ministry of Light Industries declared the debate closed. This institute, which named itself the sole authoritative technical source of information on the identification of all ancient paper in China, declared that Cai Lun was a national hero and that the theory that he invented paper in the Eastern Han was a final historical conclusion. Indeed, Pan Jixin's 2011 article for the paper history reads a bit like a manifesto to the West. In it, he describes the political blackout of virtually all scientific and archaeological study of paper in China for the last 30 years. Despite all this and the fact that all the archaeological samples have been closed to examination, most scholars continue to believe that the earliest paper is from the Western Han, based on careful archaeological collection prior to the 1970s, when Chinese archaeologists dated the earliest samples made before the time of Cai Lun. According to stratigraphy, combination of utensils unearthed together with paper, characteristics of paper, wooden slips with dates and other scientific methods. Here you see exactly, I just put on the table the all known discoveries from the archaeological excavation of the earliest paper. One of the most important examples of those early paper was found in Baqiao, unearthed in the region of Chang'an and reported in 1957, and identified by Pan Jixin in 1964 as rag paper made of hemp fibers. Pan Jixin explains the dating of the grave at Baqiao as no later than 118 BC, as an accurate result of collective scientific research. Still, even with Baqiao and other papers excavated in the western regions of China, the Institute continues to insist that this western stuff is not true paper. The map of these discoveries, however, is highly persuasive, since we cannot avoid wondering why so many of those early paper samples were discovered along the Silk Roads and in the western China. So I tried to put them all on the map so you see exactly where they were discovered. The debate on whether cotton, so we have a little bit of myth, as I mentioned, and the one of this, besides origin, is origin of rag paper technology and also cotton paper predating rag paper, which we do not really have any evidence for, and also silk paper predating rag paper. So we see that it's the history of paper. So, and it evolves. So we do not really have any evidence for cotton fibers. I was able only to find singular fibers of cotton in Sogdian manuscripts, so it's not much. But however, there are Indian paper historians and scientists who tried to persuade this. And maybe that's... Also, it's interesting origin of rag paper technology. So during the last century, the credit for inventing rag paper was bestowed upon a couple of nationalities, from Italians and Germans to Arabs and Persians, and finally to Chinese. This Chinese origin of rag paper has finally been confirmed by the appearance of the first results of fiber analysis from the Dunhuang manuscripts and other paper fragments excavated in Central Asia. Karabachek is first, in fact, supported the view that Arabs or Persians produced the first rag paper based on linen and hemp, and he excluded the idea that the Chinese could have produced the first rag paper, mostly by citing the date of 940 AD for the origin of making paper from rags in China. But it was a study of first part of 20th century. It appears that the credit for rag paper invention moved from Europe to China exactly in the opposite direction from that of paper dissemination from China to Europe. In fact, there are many contradictory statements on paper origin and dissemination, especially considering written sources in different languages. This suggests that theories based on written sources should be verified by material evidence whenever possible. Thus, it is inappropriate now to posit the existence of cotton paper in India before that of rag paper in China, especially in light of the fact that Wisner and Karabachek, who were the first scientists who examined real fibers in paper, clearly denied its existence at the beginning of the 20th century, and nobody else has been able to provide other evidence until now. Providing such evidence requires that much more research has to be done on fiber analysis and other aspects useful for resolving problems on a statistically representative group of manuscripts. Present research on fiber analysis shows that cotton fibers are only accidental, as I said. As is drafted above, from what I said, our knowledge about the beginnings and early history of paper remains very fragmentary. Many unresolved problems and unanswered questions show clearly how important evidence can be provided by manuscripts from Central Asia, which appears to have been a key region for early history of paper. We do not know if the mentioned dates are truly the most meaningful points of paper history. In fact, there exist no written records of papermaking in Central Asia in any of languages known in the region, but it does not mean that paper was not produced there at that time. Since written sources cannot be conclusive enough on the origins of papermaking, archaeological and material evidence is gaining importance. The paper manuscripts found at Gaochang, Lulan, Kusha, Khotan, Dunhuang, and Turfan sites date as early as the 3rd century. The challenge for future work is to learn more about places where the paper of those manuscripts was made. Yet what we have available are manuscripts and papers found at Silk Road sites dated as early as the 1st century AD. By expanding the scope of research from the textual content to the material characteristics, we move beyond legends to a more precise understanding of the early history of papermaking, as well as its defining development and perception. So what my work is about, it's exactly I try to reconstruct that early paper history from manuscripts of the Silk Road. And what we need is a conceptual frameworks for combining scientific and socio-historical analysis in manuscript studies. Also to identify a chronological sequence for every object of production, distribution, use, reuse, and discard. Study informed by environmental, social, and economic contexts on the one hand, and by physical properties and performance characteristics of the objects on the other hand. And of course, the very important problem which we face here is the dating of Silk Road manuscripts. We have only general date, archaeological date, like a closure of Cave 17 in Mogao, for example. But rarely dates of particular manuscripts. But still, to somehow reconstruct those early history, it is what we have. So the manuscripts from Gandhara, Kucha, Khotan, Dunhuang, and Turfan, as you see, dating of this. And also where they were found, the places and cultures and languages they are written in, as it's on the map. So my research questions here are, what were the driving forces for development of the technologies of the book? This question includes the investigation of the relationship between the development of technologies, religion, especially Buddhism, and different linguistic cultures along the Silk Road. What materials were used for making those books along the Silk Roads, and how they have been evolving with technological inventions. This is retrieved by material analysis of manuscripts and aims to help to catch technological change and learn what materials and when were outsourced. How did the technology of books spread? This question involves the examination of the driving forces of the spread of technology, including economic drives such as trade, and social and ideological drives such as religion. So my sample is, as you see here, basically altogether is about 350 manuscripts. It's 130 Chinese manuscripts from various collections, European collections, like British Library and Berlin collection, which is preserved in the Berlin Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Berlin State Library. Also from Bibliothèque Nationale de France and from the Institute of Oriental Manuscripts in St. Petersburg. Also, 70 manuscripts were written in Tibetan language, besides Chinese, and 130 Turfan fragments written in a variety of languages, such as Sanskrit, Sogdian, Tocharian, Uyghur, and other. Approximately, I selected 20 manuscripts representative for one language. And the most important, the largest amount of manuscripts I had a chance to examine were found in Mogao grottos in Dunhuang. So overall aims, to summarize, was to build up a body of data on a group of books with known place of production in our study area, to collect ethnographic information on papermaking and book production in the region. However, of course, this point was mostly to learn, because we cannot really use this evidence for interpreting the manuscripts from the first millennium. However, still, it helped to understand the features and properties of paper in manuscripts, and to put together an historical data as well as new data, textual and scientific analysis. Then to input all this data into database and make it easily accessible for other scholars. This is something what I still work on, the most difficult part, I would say. What is important before we start to talk about manuscripts is how to study of paper is in fact very interdisciplinary. So it's good to define how to look at paper. So what is paper? Paper is an object of, can be, object of daily use, an object of artistic expression, but we can also say that it is an organic compound equipped with particular properties and implementation forming a product that is the result of an economical chain connecting producers and buyers. An object of preservation for other people. Change of features due to deterioration processes is important to be noticed. An object to date and localize for historians. Is a material formed technologically, is a material formed of a webbed and random network of fibers made out of the water suspension on a bamboo textile or wire screen into felted sheet, usually of cellulose fibers. In principle, paper is made in following steps: processing the raw material to collect, separate and clean the fibers, beating and refining the fibers, diluting to form of a thin fiber slurry suspended in water solution, then forming a web of fibers on a screen, pressing the web to increase the density of material, drying to remove the remaining moisture, and finally finishing to provide a suitable surface for the intended end use. It's good to remember about all the steps, so to know what features we can read then from manuscripts. And it is also important to know, to be aware of interaction of the materials of which the manuscripts are composed, for example, like paper and ink. The aesthetic effects of this interaction sometimes define the artistic properties of the objects to a greater degree than the intentions of the scribe or artist. It is why, for example, in Chinese culture, we write with a brush on the very absorbent thin type of paper, and it gives totally different aesthetic effects than writing with a bamboo pen on Tibetan paper, for example. And the fiber properties of paper have strongly shaped the aesthetic of a given culture based upon the raw material used. So that is another layer for understanding paper. And at the same time, artists choose materials to match their creative impetus. So it is why it's good to ask what features we can really record and understand, what features of paper in manuscripts. So definitely we have subjective features which do not have much potential for historical interpretation, such, for example, color, sizing degree, of course without any further scientific technique, but just by looking at paper. And color, for example, there were many also scientific studies of color, and of course it helps to understand the degree of deterioration and type of paper until some point. But since it is, it depends on the condition what manuscripts were preserved in, so it does not give us any historical information. It's important more for conservators rather than historians. And objective features which have a potential for historical interpretation are, first of all, raw materials and technological features of paper. Those features which do not change over time. So methods which I would like to point to here, codicological description of paper, is so what we want to know. We want to know what technology was used, so what paper-making sieve was used to make particular sheet of paper, so we can, that is something what does not change during time. Fiber distribution, for example, is also helps to describe the technology and identify technology. Thickness of paper, number of layers glued together very often, surface preparation, and the most important for me, raw material. And methods which we can use to retrieve those features, first of all, it's our observation by naked eye. It's often when we go to library to study manuscripts, it's the first thing what we can do. Then documentation, digitization, measurements with caliper or micrometer of paper thickness, backlit imaging, fiber analysis, and then there is discussion on templates and databases, how to process those data and how to use it and learn from this. So the main technological features of paper which I distinguish are woven paper. I can differentiate woven paper, which is made with textile sieve, laid regular paper from bamboo sieve with chain lines intervals and visible laid lines and chain lines sometimes, laid irregular paper, where the mold is sieve is made from reed or grass, where we also can see chains sometimes, and laid patchy paper. Here you see exactly what I mean. So on the left side, just as a reference, the first one is European type of mold. Then we have the woven type of mold, which is made with this type of just a wooden frame and textile over it. And then all types of laid paper, you see on the upper photo are the distances in between chain lines when we measure if they are visible. And at the bottom is exactly what we measure, laid lines. So we measure how many laid lines are in, oh, thank you. No, this one. Okay, thank you. So here we can measure how many laid lines are in 3 centimeters. So this is a standard way how we can describe paper. So then we can compare particular types. So here is an example of the laid patchy paper, which I found in the oldest manuscripts from Dunhuang. And that is exactly the type which was made with the mold, with the sieve made probably of grass or bamboo. So you see here, for example, you see those laid lines, but they are very irregular, and in some places you cannot see them at all. So it means like water drainage was slow in some places, and it has like a little bit of both characteristics. So that's the oldest types, I would say. However, these irregular patchy papers also, sometimes it's possible, a bit different characteristic, but it's also possible to find it in later manuscripts. Here is example of irregular laid paper, which you see this sieve which was used to make this paper was already made with something stronger, like bamboo sticks, but still their characteristic is probably circa about 12, 13 laid lines in 3 centimeters. So it means that paper is relatively rough comparing to others. And to compare that type, I would like to show you the rather typical type of paper from the imperial production, which is very fine, very good quality, very even when you measure thickness. I usually measure thickness in minimum 5 places on the paper sheet. And in this kind, it's almost the same. Yeah? In the case of previous papers, the thickness varies really to quite a large extent. So we have those differences, so we can distinguish some types. And this is how I try to build my typology. Oh, I forgot to say that just to compare, in this paper, in 3 centimeters, we have circa about 30 laid lines. So you see the difference. And in more rough paper is usually around 12. So, and another example, just to compare, that's the paper most typical for all Himalayan region. So you see, I mentioned the fiber distribution. So in this type of paper, you see like a cloth, we could call it, of fibers, which exactly shows the way a paper maker just mix the pulp on the sieve and then lift it. So that's exactly what is seen here. And here, sometimes papers are dyed with some yellow dye. It's usually organic, but sometimes it's just painted with ore pigment, for example. It is usually to protect paper from insects. So, but also, possibly it was also just to make the background more even and nice. So it may be also aesthetic reasons as well. Just to compare, those papers are dated, it's the Marzon collection recently discovered in Mustang. So some of the volumes are dated to 13th century, so not much later in fact. And that's the typical Himalayan paper. However, we also found this characteristic, which is very similar in fact to many manuscripts from Dunhuang, from the Silk Road. So origin, of course, we do not know exactly origin, but it may be also local paper. And another area in the Himalayas which use this type of mold is Bhutan. But we do not, so far we do not have more information to really have some more conclusions on this. And here, again, how the woven paper look like. Sometimes to see the transparency of it, we, of course, when we work in libraries, we can use the light table and equipment. In the working in the field, sometimes it's really not possible. So only what we have is just a light, and we have to use. There's no electricity then in most cases. So it is conditions which we still. I'm showing it to you because we still can do something. It's not only that we need very complicated scientific equipment to learn. It's also possible really to work in mountains and to describe paper. So this is how we measured thickness, for example. And here just a couple of words about quality. Why we have these differences in thickness, different features, technological features, typology. It depends on how paper is made. I mentioned the particular steps. And for example, a lot depends on beating. So it is different when it's done in totally manual way. Of course, it takes much longer, some hours, but now the more modern paper, even if it's just one, I would say, one invention used, because the production in many places is still very basic, but it's mechanical beater, yeah? So that's the fibers are cut that way more, and that it is shown in the resultant sheet of paper. So some hypotheses for the application of fiber analysis in manuscript studies. First of all, this is this parameters which does not change over time. So we can, on basis of plants, if we identify the raw material, we can build kind of overlapping typologies of paper in manuscripts, and we can learn a bit about location of paper production centers. Dating through paper analysis is not really possible directly. However, by grouping, if we can compare to other information, for example, from colophons, then we can finally have some information. And finding regional origins of particular paper types, it is much more likely, I would say, by comparison of fibers to indigenous plants distributions, to economical and cultural usage of those plant fibers, and also technological practices. However, one source of information is never enough. Everything has to be double-checked and compared to all possible sources. That's the best way of proceeding with this kind of material research, since we are still at the time when we are building our data, our references. So with time, with every research, we can say a bit more, because we are learning through this. So from the history of fiber analysis, it's nothing new, in fact. The history of fiber analysis started in the beginning of 20th century with some, and at the various stages, some authors just got back to the same idea, but what has changed is, of course, technology. So now we have much more better microscopes than in the beginning of 20th century. So it is why also we can learn much more. So basically, now I would like to give you some kind of overview of methods which are available to us now and how we can work. So basically, the aim of the procedure is fiber analysis to ascertain the raw materials used for paper or textile production. And how we can do it? There is a digital microscopy and optical standard traditional microscopy. So basically, those are different types of microscopes, but it's the same purpose of using it. However, just to show you the best way to compare, for example, this is with digital microscope. Sometimes we can compare this to scanning electron microscopes, the way how we see fibers. So basically it allows, this is not a scanning, but a digital microscopy, allows for undestructive testing, what is very important nowadays, especially with all the libraries policies, that even microsampling often is not allowed. So that technique allows to see something, however, not as much as traditional microscopy, which allows to see more precisely and get along all the fibers. So this is just to compare still view from the scanning electron microscope and with traditional microscopy. The difference is that in digital microscopy and scanning electron microscopy, we we see, okay, as here, yeah, let's get, we see the surface only. So we cannot see singular fiber, we cannot trace its anatomical shape of cell from on the longer distance. And also when paper is processed and sized and we have a glue on the surface, then we see almost nothing. So this is like, but it's all, yeah, like always, some techniques have possibilities and limitations. So this is, for example, paper mulberry. So this is what we can see through optical standard microscopes. So the typical features is, for example, this primary wall, which looks like a membrane around the fibers. So, and here's how we can see the same fibers in digital microscopy. This is also, we can also use some staining which helps to identify and differentiate between fibers. It needs a lot of training to really see those features. And for example, oh, here is also paper mulberry, the same membrane which I showed you on that slide here. Yeah, you can see now here, and you can see here. Yeah, and this is how so we observed everything, fiber placing in the various magnification until the cross markings, which, let me show you, cross markings are those. Yeah, lumen is the kind of empty space in the fiber cell inside. So those features we just compare in various species. Here is the, by the way, this digital microscopy technique was developed first in Japan by Professor Enami Kazayuki. And this team, Japanese team, really mastered the way and methodology how they look at this. However, it's still not possible to identify all unknown papers that way. So usually when we start from references, we have something to compare. So that's possible to go until, but how it looks. This is, for example, the same bamboo fibers and bamboo vessels, yeah, which are very typical for bamboo paper. So we see in the optical microscope and we see the same in the digital microscope, like this. And here, when there's a rag paper, so sometimes it's possible to detect just the fragments of rag, yeah, like here's the silk throat, here's the hemp. And those photos are from Professor Enami Kazayuki. And also fibers, sometimes we have to be careful, like rami, it looks a bit differently in the textile, for example, than recycled paper. Fibers also are more processed and looks a bit differently. But traditional fiber analysis requires microsampling. So it's not much, just a couple of fibers, but still. So we have to really decide for this and carefully find also the place where the samples should be taken to record all possible features. What is important also to references and how the particular species, this is a cross-section. And we can also identify starch sometimes in plants. Yeah? Those are fibers like Daphne fibers, which are sometimes have a broadened portions. So sometimes they are very narrow, like here, and sometimes they are really wide. And the same you can see here exactly. So it's also distinguishing features. Measurements are sometimes helpful, but not really with the length of fibers, rather width of fibers, but it is just supporting element, supporting identification. Staining helps, especially in case of mixed fiber papers. We immediately can see much quicker to distinguish one from the other. However, if we do staining, we cannot keep this little sample for longer. So we have to, in that case, just document it in photographs. Just examples of Daphne. and those braided portions. The most typical fiber for Tibetan manuscripts, also found in 6 of Tibetan origin from Dunhuang. Stellera hamayasma, I haven't found it in very typical fibers also for higher altitudes and Tibetan manuscripts. I haven't found it in Dunhuang materials. However, the oldest manuscripts I found these fibers are dated to 10th to 11th century from also from central Tibet. I mentioned the kind of ethnobotanical fieldwork which helps to understand the technology. And what I have been often doing is going to botanical gardens, collecting samples of particular paper-making plants, reconstructed the paper production, I needed to make little samples of paper and then to compare to those fibers which I see in manuscripts. The distribution of fibers, distribution of plants is still the difficult part, because we do not really, this is just an example how it looks, but it's not really, it requires more extensive field work and really knowing areas, because during time the distribution can also change. However, we have general information like for example, Daphne and all the valleys of the Himalayas, yeah? So it's growing here. But unfortunately, also why we need to collect as many information as possible, because those paper-making plants are not very, some of them maybe, but most are not rare plants. They are growing in quite many areas. So problems we have with, or limitations I would say, with precision of identification in between some species. Why? Because historical material is usually deteriorated, sometimes structure of cells is changed or entirely damaged. So this is why some papers are more difficult than others. Fibers are also changed by mechanical processing during paper productions. So those which were sometimes more beaten are more difficult also to identify. And various species from the same family of plants are very similar to each other and not possible to be distinguished in every case. And for example, mulberry from paper mulberry, like Brosonetia from Morus, those plants are almost identical when I look on it at microscope. And Daphne Edgeworthia Wikströmia is the same case. It's very difficult to really distinguish those plants through microscopy. But if we do one day, it will be very helpful, because it will somehow, comparing to anthropological ethnographic fieldwork, I would say, those plants really were used in particular areas. So if we can differentiate them, it will help to point to, with much higher precision, to origins of papers. It is why we try to use DNA, ancient DNA. However, just I would like to mention this, we try to study it, but so far we, at the moment of building with my colleague Anna Schulz from University of Hamburg and food chemistry, so we try to build references for particular plants, but still to really identify plants, very large samples are needed. So large, it's simply impossible so far more than for C14. And now, as a kind of case studies, I would like to present you a couple of examples from Dunhuang manuscripts first. So the types which I was able to distinguish, the general types, it's basically rag paper and bark paper. So rag paper was composed of textile waste, mostly rami and hemp, and that paper often had the characteristic of late regular, irregular, or patchy. And possible, interesting part is possible additions here, like paper mulberry, flax, jute, silk, or cotton. Usually those are those are singular fibers to be added. However, paper mulberry is interesting addition in the rag paper, since it was not really used for rugs. But we know also that it was used for clothes, monks' clothes, for example. So maybe that is why it got into paper. So another example, this is from 5th century, and identify rag fibers on the patchy-laid structure. So as I mentioned, this technological characteristics was identified in those oldest samples I had a chance to examine. And bark paper, what means, first of all, paper made of paper mulberry, but also some manuscripts made of Daphne and Daphne species plants, mostly Tibetan and one Uyghur. And the oldest papers which I identified paper mulberry in was dated to 504 AD, with late patchy characteristic that was woven paper mulberry paper. And manuscripts dated to 8th century showed concentration of this type of paper. The significant group indicated a late regular pattern characterized by 28 to 33 laid lines in 3 centimeters. So that was the group which I showed you at the beginning as this typical for imperial production. And that was exceptionally good quality with a smooth texture and very often dyed with yellow. So exactly as you see here. And here this graph is not perfect, but why? Because different institutions did not, some institutions allowed for microsampling, some not. So in fact, the parameters and features I checked were different, so every time was a different number of manuscripts somehow. But anyhow, as you see, I hope you see, when looking separately on the types of paper, and colors are various collections. So you see that the most paper among the Silk Road manuscripts was a rag paper and late paper. So here, rag paper and with the technological characteristics of late paper. The difference is here only because the group of manuscripts was not tested for fibers, for plants, for raw materials. And woven, paper, which supposed to be simpler and more basic production, because it does not, the process of production is longer, since when paper is made and the mold is made of wooden frame with textile, and when you make it a paper, and you have to leave the form to dry for the paper sheet, and then you need to wait. And a difference to the late paper and mold with movable sieve is that you can move the sieve. So you can immediately after production, you can remove the sieve, take out the wet sheet of paper, and still use the form for further producing more paper. So that kind of technology is more developed. However, in most of our manuscripts from the tested group, the majority was late paper, so this more advanced technology. And also, comparing to, as I mentioned, bark paper, which is supposed to be more popular in 7th and 8th century, and from that time on, was the less samples than rag paper. When we look from, this is just example of Tocharian manuscripts, so somehow when I try to look from the language groups, there are differences, like I have never identified a Daphne paper in Chinese manuscripts, for example. However, when looking on many groups, there is a similar share of particular fibers. So usually it's like rag paper is a majority and the bark paper, in this case made of paper mulberry, is less, and the same like here. So exactly that were observations. I just share it with you. And just to put it, to summarize all this, so we see that rag paper made of rami, hemp, with some addition of flax or China jute. We could say that it's for the time 200 BC to 100 Common Era, and bast paper made of morus, mulberry, Browsonetia papyrifera, paper mulberry, since 105, since we have this mentioned by Cailun as his first paper and from the written sources. But concentration in manuscripts really is for 7th and 8th century, and Daphne species, Stellera species, bamboo, rice straw, and other fibers started since 9th, 10th century, but they were not identified. I haven't identified this in Dunhuang manuscripts. Some in Turfan fragments were only recorded. And another important part is to record and prepare the templates. So for every collection, it's good to somehow adjust the template and organize data as a database. And for example, this is just example which I prepare for Tibetan stuff. Besides paper, I usually record also some formats and some other codicological features of manuscripts. So it is why the books differs from each other. But this you see what can be, how it can be presented. And here, maybe as a last part, I would like to mention the dating. Yeah, this is example of a Marzon collection, because also often I got a question if it is worthy to do C14 analysis for manuscripts. Of course, depending on time, it is worthy as an independent evidence. However, for some time we can really get quite good dating with a good precision, like even plus minus 50 years. But for some more newly manuscripts, it's 300. So in such case, it does not make any sense to sample manuscripts and perform C14 analysis. That was interesting example for C14 dating, in fact, because we did not know if the collection is how it should be dated. So we performed all possible research from materials and from texts together with Charles Rumble. And for example, for all the collection, we realized that the volumes, particular volumes, are dated to different types. And also we found the colophon in one volume, which shows, which was possible from the Charles Rumble translation to know the date of the specifically this part of Kamchen was a part. And that was a difference in between, like the information from text to information from C14, from material analysis. So in such case, we can, of course, consider that paper could be stored for some time, but also we first of all see that when we look at C14 dates for this, that this example is not, we immediately know that the history of the collection is more complicated than it would look at the beginning. So background questions to those dating when compared to history was quite interesting. So it helped us somehow to put the collection in context. So I think that is for the moment all what I would like to say, and now I would be happy to answer questions. Thank you very much.
Polls of things that have been learned about particular manuscripts or groups of manuscripts using this type of paper analysis?
Again,
could you give some more examples of things that have been learned about manuscripts using this paper analysis?
Mm-hmm. Of course, there was a lot. From Dunhuang, from Turfan, as I said, the Tibetan books, which I have been working with. It's often, when compared, we can somehow localize it, more. Like the Marzon collection in the end. So nothing was known, and we were slowly able to build the dates for this and to give it background and context. For example, I have been working also with Tibetan kanjurs volumes, and for example, I was able to, with colleagues from Warsaw, authenticate Wanli kanjur, which is one of the first prints of Tibetan canon. And the collection was deemed to be lost during the war. And then when we came across of volumes, it's very difficult to identify this by text only, because it needs a lot of work, and it's not always, you often do not have any information in colophons, for example. So when we were able to compare historical data to paper analysis and to codicology also, it's not really only paper analysis. So we were able to confirm that this is that collection. So what else? It's a lot of with comparing, for example, work with a colleague from the British Library, Sam van Schaik. We were able somehow to learn. First of all, to learn from my side is learning about paper history. That's the first purpose of my research. But then, at the same time, I hope it helps to colleagues who study the history and textual studies to authenticate and to give like the base, like sources, and to date them and to localize. Also, for example, recently studies of handwritings, So when we, for example, have a group of manuscripts written like we did with Charles Ramble during last years, we selected the documents which were written by the same scribes, the same scribe. We had the name, and we try to describe and compare handwriting in those documents. So quite interesting information we were able to retrieve from this. That it's easy is that that the character. It was sometimes we can compare the types of paper, then to the others documents, and the same characteristics of handwriting. Of course, those research are ongoing, so I don't know what else. Did I answer your question, or?
Yes, I think so. Thank you.
Yes, that was a great talk. On the basis of your research, I wonder if you think it is possible that paper was developed independently in different geographic regions. In other words, many of the historians that you look at assume there must be a single source for these different types.
Of course. Of course, I think this is why all this research, and I think it's important. I'm not trying to say that it was not like we think, and it's not at all, but it may be more complicated than we think, because now we have just a few written sources and a few mentions, like the beginning, then the Arab world, and then Europe, and it's not much else. And of course it's possible that it was in a couple of places of Central Asia, for example.
you
But
think
we
it's
do not
plausible?
know.
Is it plausible that, in other words, is it going to be more likely that it was developed independently in different places, and that's what's causing the...
But basically, we do not have any evidence, like all those questions which I mentioned about India, we do not have any evidence for this. So evidence shows that it was in China, but which part, and if it's exactly this, what we have from Ceylon beginning, so it's probably not only this. Probably it was, and then how it is, it's what I'm interested in, how it has moved, how technology moved, and who really learned from whom. So it seems like we just have some points which are maybe quite accidental. Oh, that's what I think.
Thank you very much for the talk. Could you say just a bit more about the basic technology? You used the word lines, 3 lines and so on. Were you talking about the sieve, or I didn't quite understand the basic technology that you were talking about when you talk about there's a certain amount of lines?
So you mean the laid lines here? You mean the sieve print of paper making mold, right?
I think that's it.
Yeah. Okay. So
Yes.
let's. So what we see in the paper structure is the print of paper making sieve, which is a part of the mold. And now, how we can detect it? In the all history of European paper, what people are mostly, what is history of paper based on, are watermarks. So in Asian paper, it's a totally different story, because we do not have watermarks, first of all. So we only can detect, but we still can detect technology. So basically, I mentioned like 2 basic types of this paper making molds and sieves, and all from technology. There's this dipping mold and floating mold. Floating mold is usually with this woven with textile sieve. So basically it does not give any print, as you see here. Or sometimes in the modern, now in, for example, still a traditional production, use, for example, the same very basic sieves with plastics on it instead of textiles. So this also can be, we can notice a difference. And for those laid lines and chain lines, the laid lines are prints of bamboo sticks, I would say, which are sewn together with the originally, usually it was horse hairs. Yeah, so that is interesting because some papers have them, so we can measure distances, which somehow it is the kind of fingerprint of the mold, particular mold used. However, in some papers, we cannot see them at all. And sometimes it's also that even at one paper-making mold, we can see it partly. It was such a case where that was supposed that in between panels that possibly another fragment of paper was inserted, and that was discussion if those both sides before is really the same sheet of paper. And on one side we could see the chain lines, on the other not. And it does not necessarily mean that it was different type of paper, since this horse hairs, it's often, the mold is also wore up when it is rolled and unrolled, so it's often damaged. So in some case that can be reason, so we see it only partly and in other side not. But definitely what is all about, we can detect the same, which group papers by those features. So it does not allow us all this feature alone definitely does not allow us to date or anything, but it allows us to group the same paper with the same characteristics. So that's like a first stage to learn more about origin. So, and those measurements in 3 centimeters is just to try to for typology, yes, try to detect the same types.
This may be sort of ignorant, but you've got, particularly in Dunhuang, you've got Sogdian manuscripts and Tocharian manuscripts, and I know a lot of Tibetan. Are you seeing much difference, and I know it depends on dating too, between the different, I mean, if it's in Sogdian, is it, it was written by Sogdian, are there a lot of different types of paper when you're selling chain lines or whatever, and can you say, oh yeah, the Sogdians always use this kind of thing, or the Tocharians, can you differentiate that much with them?
Yes, until some point, but yes, for example, Sogdian paper, it was very much differently processed, yeah? So by different levels, maybe I haven't mentioned this part enough, but the fibers is like a first level, then technology, which means paper making mold, then it comes processing of paper surface. And in that case, for example, like Sogdian were nicely polished and processed that way. The same Tocharian, for example. That paper was very often coated with white clay or white pigment. So they differ.
So they
And
could be,
various,
they could be made one
yes,
way,
yes,
not-
yes.
Yeah. Oh,
Mhm.
okay, that's what I meant.
Okay, thank you very much. I also need some clarification, and I have one new question.
Sure.
So the term laid lines
Mhm.
is the horizontal line, is that correct?
Yes,
That's
in
the
this
mold
case.
itself. That's right, that's just part of the fabric that's in the mold, that's in the frame, the seat, is that correct? And that's not necessarily intended to be shown on the paper, but you can see it through the analysis, as opposed to the chain line, which seems to be a vertical line, is that correct? No.
It's okay. So chain lines and laid lines. It's only, I would say, if it's vertical or horizontal, depends how the paper is mounted, right? Usually depends also on shape. In most cases, like it's like the sieve looks a bit like the mat for the sushi roll. Yeah. So those are bamboo sticks sewn together. So this is just a print
That's
of the.
the remnant of the seat fabric, I understand. But the reason I ask is because we see in old manuscripts that there seems to be also vertical lines that are used to separate the writing in Chinese, to help people write the characters straight. Whereas these laid lines seem to be in the fabric of the paper itself, is not used by the people writing on the paper. Does that make sense? Is that a different line?
It's a different line, I would
What do
say,
you call
because
that
that's the no, that's the like you see the scroll, for example. Yes, so we have like 2 layers of information. One is like panels, and they panels can be just from the sheets of paper glued together. You have the one line. Then sometimes there are like the lines and or spaces empty just by scribes, yeah, left. So we have the panels of text. This is like a different thing. And chain and laid lines is something else, still technological features. And if they are vertical, it depends. Sometimes it differs. Depends how the panels of scrolls were made.
Okay, so
And-
just finally, could you explain the difference between a chain line and a laid line? I still don't understand.
Okay, so laid lines is from bamboo sticks.
Right.
And chain lines in from the sewing of this together.
Sewing of-
Yes.
Oh, I see, okay.
Because those bamboo sticks have to be
Sewn
joined
together.
together, yes,
Sewn
kept together
Thank you.
to roll.
That helps a lot.
So sorry.
All right.
Sorry, I have not been enough clear, I see.
Okay, so the other question I have is you didn't talk about ink at all.
Mhm.
And I know that ink is also made in different ways by different people in different places. Are you using that in your analysis as
Not really me. I have been collaborating with my colleague Renate Neller some years ago, who is a mineralogist, and she did, for the Dunhuang manuscripts, she did a lot of ink measurements, and I did the paper. So, yeah, it's possible to record it in a way. However, still probably we are not able to link it to regions, yeah, to particular deposits. That's not yet possible. The problem with ink is that it's most of black inks are based on carbon, so it's not easily, and additions, which sometimes modifications, I would say, it's not easily detectable by scientific measures.
I'm a written scholar, history department. I'm very interested in this report. It is a very rich and technical report. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I think, as we all know, paper is invented in China. But what I care about is how it spread. And the second question is, what is the specific route? And when you do this report, whether you think about this question. Thank you.
So the question is about how the paper spread? This is what you're asking?
Yeah.
Or transmissions, right?
And the specific route. What is the specific route?
That's still something what we are trying to find out. Definitely the main direct purpose of the research, what we were able to learn from this analysis on Dunhuang manuscripts, for example, so to group the manuscripts a little bit by origins. So, for example, like the manuscripts which I identified on Daphne paper, so it comes out that they were from Miran and Miran region. So it's like that's rag paper. Many manuscripts, when we compare to information in colophons, were kind of regional in the area of Dunhuang. We do not know exactly where. We cannot maybe we never will, point to particular points like a place. Yeah. Also, the group from made of paper mulberry, most were probably along where the paper mulberry grows. However, it's also some. We cannot exclude that some paper mulberry, because it was cultivated for silk production too. Yeah, so they were also along the Silk Road, but many were from eastern part. Yeah, so that's that way. And how the paper spread. It's not directly that my research are able to answer anything. It's when compared to, for example, those results on Tibetan books, yeah, like dated to some we were able to from 11th and 13th century. And this is definitely Daphne paper or Stellera paper. And that's the technology moved probably from China. So, but what exact road, I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's really interesting. My question is, do you make a distinction between the movement of manuscripts and the movement of paper? In other words, paper, say, as a commodity. Is there evidence that it moved large distances as a commodity itself? Or are you saying that was I guess.
I think that rather paper movement was a bit secondary to manuscripts because that's my impression from this study is that somehow manuscripts moved first, and then in particular places the people felt the need to make paper and learn technology. So that was rather that way. And it is why we see that from China, that's from the this area, especially paper mulberry, and that best quality papers, yeah, comes. It's still it's mastered in this this imperial type. And then when it was technology somehow, if we really assume that it moved to the West, yeah, but it may be in the other places that started, there was a need to make paper, to copy manuscripts, for example. So this more rough types could be made there, for example. And all this rag paper, which was not associated in the many years ago really with Chinese paper. So that is something a little bit mysterious where it started. Yeah. So I would, how I think about the paper transmission of paper making technology. So might be that it started in a couple of places, the same time or not very long from each other. Simply in some places were mastered more, up to really good quality. In some places it stayed quite simple. So that's, but definitely I think manuscripts transmissions was, but also we have about directions, yeah, like how manuscripts travel. So manuscripts travel from the south on palm leaves, and then somehow they started to be produced on paper. It's opposite to the paper road, like Tibetan manuscripts and how the manuscripts traveled.
This may be another very speculative question, and you'd like hard evidence, but does anybody ever speculate that there may have been an intermediate period between bark, the use of bark and palm leaves and things like that, and the evolution of paper? Is there something in between there?
I think, so no, I don't know if it's something in between this, but we should remember that those materials are, especially like palm leaves, are very local, yeah? So it is why when manuscripts, for example, traveled from the south, yeah, palm leaf manuscripts, through the Tibet, and all the literature, yeah, religion was traveling from that side. And then, of course, in Tibet there is no palm leaves, so technology was going down. So I can't... I don't know what you mean by in between.
Oh, I kind of imagined, a bunch of palm leaves falling apart, and then someone is trying to glue them together, and they go, oh, paper.
No, I don't think. I don't think so. No, we have various materials like a birch bark also, yeah. But those are very local.
But they also would use leather, so it is about what resource you add on that.
But leather in this region, which
not
do,
in this region.
yeah, different. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but there are materials which have very local coverage, like palm leaves or papyrus. Yeah, they're thinking widely about all the world, and there are materials like paper or also leather, yeah, which could be produced much wider areas, not so limited locally to the distribution of plants. Mm. Yes. Thank you.